Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Bill Kurland. Bill is a misfit. A former musician, he spent the last 15 years working at the intersection of brand strategy and experience design. He's built, grown, and led high-performing teams through transformation at organizations of all sizes, from unicorn startups to Fortune 15 corporations. Currently, he's a global experience design director at McDonald's, leading the cross-disciplinary Design Foundations group, consisting of accessibility, design systems, design technology, and UX writing teams. Bill, welcome to the show.
Oh, wow. I almost sound like a cool person. I'm so glad to be here.
No problem. You sound very serious.
Yeah, well, that entire premise will be disabused for yourself and all listeners as soon as we start talking about anything, but this topic in particular.
And your chosen topic is?
Punk rock. Love punk rock. So for background, why I chose this topic, even though I am a 40-year-old corporate person now, I just grew up in a community of punk rockers, and what I appreciated so much about it was that, yes, you could have the some of the people who were very militaristic almost and specific about well, you're not a punk unless you blah, 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 blah. Fill in the gaps here. But the punk rock community that I experienced was a punk rock community with people from different countries, different colors, different creeds, different sexual orientations, different gender identities. That's the punk rock that I knew and loved, and why I love to talk about it, which is the music's great, but the community is even cooler.
So we're going to talk about punk rock, not just the music, but the ethos.
Yeah. I think as compared to maybe other genres of music, the ethos and the music are so enmeshed and intertwined that I think that's why it ends up being a particularly interesting topic for me.
As I like to do in this podcast, I like to start with the origin story. How did you become aware of punk rock?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of what the inciting incident was. I never had an older brother, but my friends had older brothers. They were all into punk music and the punk subculture and all of that kind of stuff. So I think I first got exposed to that when I was about 12, and I'd always loved music. I made my first professional dollar playing my Mickey Mouse guitar at the Chicago Blues Fest at 2 years old. Somebody who was there gave me a dollar bill and was like, "Keep at it, kid." And music was always a big part of my family. I wrote my first song called "I Can Do It by Myself" when I was 2 years old and recorded it. The Talking Heads, Stop Making Sense was always on repeat on VHS in my house. The David Bowie Glass Spider tour was always on VHS on repeat in my house. I was always rocked to sleep to music. So music being so important to me, I started playing music when I was 6 or 7. I played in orchestra, I played in jazz, I played in all these different genres, and then punk rock, which I got to know at around 12, was this cool new thing, and community. And so the really interesting part was when I got into punk rock as compared to my other friends whose parents were I can't believe you're listening to punk, I can't believe you're into this crap, are you gonna dye your hair green and put glue in your hair or whatever. My dad, who is an English teacher and was a big fan of music, gave me two things. He gave me a copy of The Clash's Sandinista, which is like this sprawling 3-record punk in quotation marks because it's punk, it's jazz, it's gospel, it's soul. It's like this genre bending record from a punk band. And then he also gave me a copy of Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain's Please Kill Me, which is a oral history of punk rock from the 60s to like the early 90s when it kind of falls apart for everybody. So it was also like this interesting like rebellion but connection with my father we are still very close and have always been close, but even at an age where I was like trying to distance myself from authority figures, it was like this interesting moment of cultural connection.
So let's start with the definitions. What defines punk rock for you?
I think it's the attitude of no one's coming to save you but yourself and your friends. Like we're gonna figure out what the solution is together and we're gonna solve it together. But yeah, I think it is a little bit of that, the DIY stuff, the do-it-yourself, the we're gonna be the change we want to see in the world, not wait for somebody to change for us.
So what were some of the first artists that, after that initial introduction, that you got into?
Yeah. The classics, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, I guess at the time it was kind of like third wave punk. So a lot of the Vans Warped Tour bands and Rancid and AFI and all these kind of bands. But those were the first ones. I got this great 4 CD compilation of like punk from 1976 to 1979. And it was everything from the bands you'd expect, like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, but also going through to like Wire and some of that, and Television, and some of the more earlier new wave, later punk bands, like post-punk bands. So it kind of all started there for me, and then really branched out as I started to understand like how diverse you could get in your expectation of what punk rock is. I was making a Spotify playlist specific for this podcast because I was like, what's something I could do that would be, like, I spend so much time thinking about design and design strategy and all these other things. I was like using the great concept that you came up with, like what could I spend more time doing? And I like went back to a lot of punk rock music and things like that, and started mapping in that playlist like the history of punk, and it going back to, in my opinion, a lot of the records of people like Screamin' Jay Hawkins or Little Richard, people who were pushing the boundaries of what this new rock and roll format could be. And the subject matter of Tutti Frutti, at minimum, is like, how could you be more punk rock than that at that particular time? So anyway, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I started with the essentials of, Velvet Underground, Sex Pistols, all that stuff, and then really like continued going forward while also like looking back further to what the real beginnings of this genre and culture was.
So that's interesting because you mentioned the quote unquote the classics of punk rock, but you also said you went backwards and forward, and things that would not be probably categorized officially as punk rock. You've identified some sort of a germ, or their essence is sort of aligns with the ethos of punk rock. Are you more drawn to things that, again, may not be on the surface punk rock, but have that in them?
Yeah, I think that is really what I've always been kind of genre agnostic when it comes to my tastes in media, whether that's movies or books or music or whatever. And I feel like it's, yeah, like as I look through the past, present, and future of punk, it's less about, is it 3 chord, 2 minute classic understanding of punk, but is it more like pushing at the boundaries of something and pushing toward, and I guess like it could be as much pushing toward the past, like the Ramones, who were inspired by the Ronettes, or Sex Pistols, who were even influenced by like contemporaries like Roxy Music or whatever, really pushing at something. And maybe that's kind of the constant thread, is like pushing at the boundaries.
Is that something that it was important for you growing up to sort of get that permission maybe from music that it's okay to push against things?
Yeah, or maybe it was the, like I was doing that. Like I was pushing a lot of boundaries. There may or may not have been some oppositional defiance disorder in my early childhood, who's to say. There was a lot of that in my life, of why do I have to go to school? And because you have to was just never a particularly intriguing answer to me. You know, if someone could say, well, it gives you the opportunity to play more music more of the time, like that was a more compelling value proposition to me as a kid than like, well, it's going to help you get, you know, some job that in accounting or whatever. So yeah, I think just a lot of like defiance, and I like really hated being told what to do from an early age, and finding value in things instead of taking them at face value, I guess. Like it, presumptions instead of real interest, I guess, might have been where that came from.
So besides music or outside of music, where else did you find, what else was punk rock for you, or still is?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, definitely like coming from like a fashion perspective, feeling like you could kind of wear whatever you wanted to wear, and in that respect, like not that I ever really took advantage of that, like a black shirt and a black hoodie and black jeans were always the thing that I was wearing. But, you know, knowing you could go down that route if you wanted to, or I don't know, what are other things that are punk rock to me? I think oppositional politics, in taking a stand for something, in protecting other people and taking a stand for them. Not necessarily like, it may have sounded like I'm just going to oppose everything, but I think with a purpose, finding what I value and being true to that was maybe also something that I really found in punk rock. Like I care about people and their betterment, and I think that's also why like I got into design leadership, not to talk about that, but because I don't do it because I want to bend anyone to my will as much as like make space for other people. The punk community, the ideas behind punk rock, the people were about, not entirely, but from my experience, like what drew me to it was making space for other people to like find themselves and to stand together about something.
You mentioned the fashion. We talked about music. What about other pop culture things? Books, TV, movies? Did you look for the things that were more subversive or different?
You know, it's weird because in a lot of ways, like I have this meta punk rock thing that I've noticed that I do, which is, for example, a lot of my friends had tattoos. So like I was like, well, I mean, the punk thing to do, the quote unquote punk thing to do is to get tattoos. But the real punk thing to do is to not get tattoos because my friends have tattoos, because it like this weird thing that developed in my life of wanting to be a part of with my friends, but also like wanting to stand out from my friends. Tattoos being an example, or like I never enjoyed Charles Bukowski. And while all my friends are like, you know, reading Charles Bukowski and reading Jack Kerouac and being like, isn't On the Road the best book? And like all that stuff. I was like, no. I much prefer like Vonnegut if we're gonna go there. I don't know. I also had some of that oppositional stuff toward like things that would be expected or assumed of punk rock. Like Sid Vicious being a really good example. Like I really disliked the connection of Sid Vicious and that like persona to punk rock of it's just about destroy and it's not about talent and it's not about precision. It's not about appreciation. It's just about like sloppiness and lack of care, which is really interesting when you even look at like Steve Jones, the guitarist in the Sex Pistols, and how great of a like rhythm guitar player and lead guitar player he was on those tracks, and like how in the pocket he was, like how much care he showed up with as compared to like how much dismissal of appreciation, I guess, like Sid Vicious represented. I also, in my personal life, did a lot of Sid Vicious-y things. So who am I to to judge?
But that's an interesting point. And for me, I don't know if it for you as well, but for me, it brings up the question of authenticity. How much do you sort of lock into the authenticity of punk rock versus maybe something that's a bit more of a facade?
Yeah, that's a great question. You have great questions. I love this. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, authenticity, right? Because especially in the punk community where there can be this policing of authenticity. Like I've seen that. I watched that happen in Chicago and the punk rock scene and stuff like that. Like you're not punk unless you meet these criteria, and isn't that essentially the antithesis of what you're supposed to be about anyway? So I think for me, I had struggled as a kid with authenticity and like who am I and what do I want to be, and like as someone that experienced some bullying at an early age and stuff like that, there was a part of my personality that was very much about being malleable to the situation and being able to make friends and self-protect and all that stuff. So I think there was also the desire to show up as authentically as possible. So like that interesting internal tension of I want to be friends with people, but I also just want to be myself, and those things can be in conflict, right? I think there was maybe like a desire for authenticity that I didn't really get to until that I really wanted and really strived for, but maybe wasn't realized until later in my life. It is such a interesting part of punk because there's also some like just even in the last couple of years, like the people that I've seen who are part of punk bands or part of the punk rock community, and like them being called out for like alleged abuse and stuff like that, and the volume of abuse, and that's technically being authentic, and how messed up is that, right? So yeah, I guess I don't know, it's so nuanced, right? I guess it boils down to like I just want to be a good person and show up as a good person who is supportive of other people, and I don't know, I feel empowered, more empowered than disempowered to do that in the framework of punk rock and whatever it means to me.
Doing quick math, you started listening to you got acquainted with punk rock in the 90s.
Yeah.
With bands like you mentioned Rancid, AFI. How do you feel about the sort of the evolution of punk afterwards?
So much good music. I know some people who definitely, the era they grew up in was the era that was, the best music in their opinion. But I really love being able to continuously look back and look forward. When it comes to looking back, like even before my era, Touch and Go Records in Chicago with bands like Big Black and Naked Ray Gun and The Effigies and Articles of Faith, like all these great Chicago 80s bands of this scene that existed with people like Jeff Bezzotti, Steve Albini. Super cool to look back on. And then now to see the influence of in Chicago bands like Meatwave, or there's this fun band Rad Payoff that was kind of like my era of Chicago punk bands. And even more recent bands like the Bad Nerves from England are incredible. I listened to so much of their like Ramonesy kind of like poppy but not pop punk, like really great stuff. They're a lot of fun. Even things like Turnstile, which put out a great record not too long ago that was like hardcore, but like super catchy hardcore. And I could list millions of other bands, but there are bands that I'm nostalgic for, certainly, but I don't feel like we're trapped in this, or I don't want to be trapped in the bubble of, well, trapped in the bubble of one, the genre of punk, but also the era of punk that I grew up in. So always looking for new things, new bands, new music that's coming through, and find a lot of excitement when it's like, oh yeah, this band reminds me of Flipper, but like in doing things Flipper would never dream of, like really, really like pushing those boundaries, right?
So, whenever talking about music, there's a tendency to sort of look at the dichotomy of music and lyrics. What's your perspective on that?
It's a good question. There's this movie, 80s movie with Tom Berenger and Joe Pantoliano, and I forget the Michael Paré, called Eddie and the Cruisers, that I used to watch when I was a kid a lot. And one of the big things that they said in that movie was like, words and music, you know, they go together. You know, you got Wordman and Eddie, who does the music. I always used to, when I was writing songs, the idea could start its expression from words or from music. Could be a riff, could be great lyric that you start with, that you build the riff upon and build the song around. So I don't know that I have like, it's all about the lyrics for me, or it's all about the music for me, as much as that ideally they're both great. And if not, at least one of them's got to be really good. Yeah, it's for the reason that I don't, I've tried. I want it on the record that I've really tried to understand the appeal of Fish, but it's for that reason that I just can't figure it out, where it's like, I can't get into the riffs. I can't get into the groove. I can't get into the lyrics. And if there was maybe like a melody or a lyric or a groove or, you know, something like that that I could really get into, I'd at least be able to, they might hook me, but none of that exists for me there.
Before we finish up, the first episode of this season, I talked to Karen Van Houten about 80s new wave music. And I asked her, give me 5 albums that someone who wants to go into this genre and get a sample of what it offers can start with. What would you pick, those 5 albums that, they don't have to be representative, but you would recommend a newcomer into punk rock?
Well, I would definitely say The Clash's Sandinista, which I think does a great job of kind of saying, bringing into question like what punk rock is, and if this can be a punk rock record, then what can't be. So I would say that being one. I would also say, I forget the name of the record, but it was by this band called Death, which was in a mid to early 1970s band that really got overlooked, but were really like pioneers of punk rock, and were like a Detroit band that I think there was a great documentary about them. But like, listen to that, because that is what early punk rock can be. I would also say, that's 2, right? So I've got a bunch more. I would say if you aren't aware of Guitar Wolf being a Japanese noise band from starting in the 90s. Actually, I take that back. Not Guitar Wolf. I'm going to say the Michelle Gun Elephant because I think they're actually less well known. They were a great Japanese punk band. So Thee, Michelle Gun Elephant. Weird backstory to that song, or to that band name. I would also say this band called Viz Queen, Visqueen. They put out a record maybe 20 years ago called King Me that I absolutely loved and got to see them at Bottom Lounge in Chicago, and that was really cool. I would also say I consider them punk rock. The Comet is Coming, which is like this very interesting like jazz / noise band that's super good. And then Idols. I'm just a big fan of Idols, IDLES. And their record Crawler hit me at a particular time during the pandemic that I needed to hear some of those things. So I would say those. But I would say I put together like a playlist of like 14 hours worth of music. So like go there, have fun.
Definitely going to link to that in the show notes. But in a very punk rock way, I asked for 5 albums and you gave me 6. So that's awesome.
That's the way it pushed the boundaries, right? Just ever so slightly.
Bill, where can people find you?
Usually you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting some stuff there. I think that's the place. LinkedIn's kind of become the place. Also on Spotify, like go out to check out this Design Downtime Punk playlist. Otherwise, like you can find me. If you can find me, it'll be at my house with my cat and my wife. And hopefully you can't find me there.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
This is awesome. Thanks so much for the invite.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.